Austin, Texas, in the year 1884, was a city of strange contradictions. By day, it was a bustling frontier capital, the air filled with the scent of cedar, horses, and the sweat of 1,000 laborers building the grand Texas state capitol. But as the sun dipped behind the hills, the city transformed. A peculiar purple haze would settle over the horizon, a phenomenon the locals called the Violet Crown. It was beautiful. It was peaceful. And in the winter of 1884, it became a shroud. You have to understand the isolation of this time. There were no streetlights as we know them. Once the sun went down, the city was swallowed by a blackness so thick you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. People relied on the moon, or the flickering orange glow of a kerosene lamp. In this darkness, a man, or a monster, began to move. He didn't come with a shout or a gunshot. He came with a silence that seemed unnatural. On New Year's Eve, while the rest of the city toasted to a new year of progress, the midnight assassin claimed his first victim. Her name was Molly Smith. She was a cook, a young woman with her whole life ahead of her, sleeping in a small wooden cabin behind her employer's mansion. The killer didn't just break in, he glided. He bypassed locked doors and windows as if they didn't exist. He struck with a heavy axe. But the horror didn't end there. He used sharp, thin objects to pose the body in a way that suggested a ritual, a dark message left for the city to find. The most terrifying part? The guard dogs. The Hall family owned fierce dogs that would snarl at any stranger. That night, they didn't make a sound. It was as if the killer was a ghost, or perhaps someone they knew. The police were desperate. They arrested Molly's boyfriend, a man named Walter Spencer. They beat him until he bled, forcing a confession for a crime he didn't commit. They thought the nightmare was over. They were wrong. As 1885 progressed, the bodies began to pile up. Eliza Shelley, Irene Cross, and then, the most heartbreaking of all, Mary Rainey. She was only 11 years old, snatched from her bed in the dead of night. The city of Austin fell into a state of great panic. Business owners locked their doors at 4 p.m. Men patrolled their front porches with Winchesters across their laps. Any man seen walking the streets after dark was likely to be shot on sight. The trust that holds a community together was rotting away. The city council decided they needed a radical solution. They spent a king's ransom to build the Moonlight Towers, 17 iron giants, 165 feet tall, casting a cold electric glare over every alleyway and backyard. They wanted to murder the darkness itself. But even under the glare of the new lights, on Christmas Eve, 1885, the assassin struck his most famous blow. He attacked 2 wealthy homes on opposite sides of the city simultaneously. He proved that no amount of light could stop a man who truly belonged to the shadows. And then, as quickly as the bloodbath began, it ended. The Christmas Eve massacre was the finale. The killer vanished. The Texas Rangers arrived to find a cold trail and a city paralyzed by trauma. But 3 years later, in 1888, the city of London began to scream. Jack the Ripper had arrived in Whitechapel. Historians have long pointed to a suspect named Maurice. He was a Malay cook who lived in a boarding house just blocks away from where the Austin victims died. Records show that Maurice boarded a ship and left Texas just after the last murder. He arrived in London just before the first Ripper victim was found. The similarities are too precise to be a coincidence. The poses, the surgical knowledge, the way both killers seemed to vanish into thin air. Did the Midnight Assassin simply trade the dust of Texas for the fog of London? Today, the Moonlight Towers still glow over Austin. They are the only ones left in the world. Beautiful, historic, and born from a year of pure terror. If you ever stand beneath one, look at the long shadows they cast. Some secrets are meant to stay hidden. In the deep rolling hills of Bavaria in the year 1922, the world was a place of profound and heavy silence. Hinterkaifeck was more than just a farm. It was a fortress of isolation, a cluster of stone and timber, standing alone against the encroaching dark of the Weidhofen woods. The Gruber family lived a life of strict routine, far from the eyes of the law and the gossip of the village. But as the winter of 1922 tightened its grip, the atmosphere on the farm changed. It wasn't the cold that chilled their bones. It was the growing realization that the silence was no longer empty. Something was watching from the edge of the woods, where the pines grow thick and the shadows never truly lit. It began with the small things. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch of the family, found a newspaper lying in the snow of the courtyard. It was a Munich Gazette, fresh and dry, despite the fact that no one in the family had ordered it, and the nearest postman was miles away. Then, the keys vanished. Every iron key to the main house and the heavy tool sheds disappeared from their hooks overnight. Andreas searched the house from the damp cellar to the dusty rafters, but they were simply gone. He didn't tell his wife. He didn't want to frighten the children. But that night, he sat by the dying embers of the fire with a loaded rifle across his lap, listening to the house groan under the weight of the snow and a sound he couldn't quite name. The next morning, the horror became visible. After a fresh dusting of snow, Andreas stepped onto the porch and saw them. Deep, heavy boot prints leading from the dark forest straight to the back door of the machine shed. He followed them with a lantern, expecting to find a traveler seeking warmth. But the tracks ended at the door. He circled the entire building, looking for the footprints leading away, back toward the trees. There were none. Whoever had walked toward the house was still inside. He was standing somewhere in the dark, breathing the same cold air as the family. Andreas locked the doors that night, but he didn't realize that the locks were useless if the intruder was already under the same roof. For 3 nights, the family lived in a state of silent terror. Above their heads, in the dark, cramped space of the attic, they heard it. The rhythmic, slow pacing of a heavy-set man. Thump, creak, thump. It wasn't the scurry of a rat or the settling of old timber. It was the weight of a person. When Andreas finally worked up the courage to climb the ladder, he found the attic empty. But he found something else. 2 indentations in the hay where someone had been lying down, watching the floorboards. He found a strange tool, a heavy pickaxe that didn't belong to the farm. He went back down to his family, but he remained silent. He didn't want them to know that the shadow in the attic was real. The most terrifying part of the Hinterkaifeck story is what happened after the screams stopped. For 3 full days, the farm remained active. Smoke curled from the chimney into the frozen air. The cattle were fed and watered. The dog was tied up. Neighbors even saw a man standing in the yard, staring at the road in the moonlight. The killer wasn't in a rush to leave. He had made himself at home. He ate their food, drank their milk, and slept in their beds, surrounded by the silence of the people he had replaced. He was the ghost of Hinterkaifeck, finally claiming the home he had watched for so long. To this day, No one knows who lived in that attic. The shadow remains, a permanent resident of the hills, waiting for the snow to fall once again. The Outer Hebrides are not merely islands. They are the jagged teeth of the earth, rising out of a cold and gray Atlantic. On the highest, most desolate point of Isle Moor stands the Flannan Isle's lighthouse. It is a lonely pillar of stone, built to withstand the fury of the North Sea, but it was never meant to guard against the shadows that come from within. In December of 1900, 3 men were tasked with keeping the light: Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. These were not men prone to fantasy or fear. They were seasoned keepers, hardened by years of isolation and the relentless rhythm of the tide. But the ocean has a way of wearing down the mind, especially when the mist rolls in and the mainland disappears from view. On the night of December the 15th, the world beyond the island noticed something impossible. A passing steamer, the Archdor, battling through the swells, looked toward the horizon for the familiar, sweeping beam of the Flannan light. But there was only darkness. The great lens, which usually cut through the thickest fog for 20 miles, was dead. On the mainland, the authorities waited, hoping it was merely a mechanical failure or a shortage of oil. But as the days passed and the horizon remained black, a heavy dread began to settle over the coast. Something had gone wrong on that rock, something that had silenced the one thing meant to keep the world safe. When the relief ship, the Hesperus, finally managed to land on the slick black rocks of Isle Moor, the silence they found was absolute. There were no welcoming shouts, no flag raised on the staff. The iron gate to the compound was locked tight from the inside. When the rescuers finally broke into the living quarters, they found a scene that defied logic. The beds were neatly made. The kitchen was clean. On the table sat a meal of salted mutton and potatoes, cold and untouched, as if the men had been about to eat when some sudden nameless force called them away. One chair lay overturned on its side, the only sign of haste in a room otherwise frozen in perfect order. It was the lighthouse logbook that provided the most chilling clues. The final entries, written in a trembling hand, spoke of a storm so powerful it made the giant stone tower shake to its foundations. It described the men as sitting together, weeping and praying for the end to come. But here is the mystery. According to every weather station on the mainland and every ship in the vicinity, the weather. Those nights had been perfectly calm. There was no storm. The sea was as still as glass. The tempest the men described existed only at the lighthouse, a private hurricane that seemed to target the rock alone. When the search of the island was complete, the men were nowhere to be found. The heavy iron railings on the western landing had been twisted like wire by a massive force, and a supply crate 40 feet above the sea level had been smashed to splinters. Some believe a rogue wave, a mountain of water from the deep, swept them all away in a single second. Others point to the overturned chair and the locked door, suggesting the men didn't fall into the sea, but were taken from the room itself. As you listen to the rhythmic pulse of the waves tonight, remember the light of Isle Moor. The tower still stands, and the light still shines, but the sea never returned what it took that December night. In December of 1872, the Atlantic Ocean was a vast, unforgiving desert of gray water and towering swells. The Dei Gratia, a sturdy brigantine sailing toward Gibraltar, spotted a speck on the horizon that seemed out of place. As they drew closer, they recognized the silhouette of the Mary Celeste. a ship that had departed New York 8 days before them. But the Mary Celeste was behaving strangely. Her sails were torn and fluttering wildly in the wind, and she was veering aimlessly, as if no one was at the helm. The captain of the Dei Gratia signaled, but there was no response. The ocean, usually a place of constant labor and noise, was suddenly, hauntingly still. When a small boarding party finally climbed onto the deck of the Mary Celeste, the silence they encountered was heavy enough to feel. They expected to find a crew ravaged by illness or a ship broken by a storm, but what they found was far more unsettling. The ship was in nearly perfect condition. The crew's waterproof boots were lined up neatly by their bunks. The captain's personal cabin still held his wife's sewing machine and a harmonium, untouched. In the galley, breakfast appeared to have been recently prepared. Yet, there was not a single soul on board. 10 people, the captain, his wife, their young daughter, and 7 crewmen, had simply vanished into the salt air. The clues left behind only deepened the mystery. The ship's single lifeboat was missing, but the iron railing where it usually hung had not been lowered. It had been forcibly removed. The ship's pump was disassembled on the deck, and there was a small amount of water in the hold, but nothing that would have caused a seasoned captain to abandon his vessel. Most confusing of all was the cargo. 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, all accounted for, though 9 were found to be empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no evidence of piracy. The Mary Celeste was a floating ghost, a perfectly preserved snapshot of a life that had been interrupted in a single, terrifying instant. For over a century, theories have swirled through the mist of history. Some speak of a seaquake that released toxic fumes from the cargo, panicking the crew into a fatal escape. Others suggest a massive waterspout that threatened to pull the ship under. But no theory explains why a captain would take his wife and child into a tiny lifeboat in the middle of the deep ocean, leaving behind a perfectly seaworthy ship filled with supplies. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine the Mary Celeste drifting alone in the moonlight. The wheel spins slowly with the tide, the sails snap in the wind, and the secrets of the crew remain locked beneath the dark, white-capped waves of the Atlantic.